Okay, welcome to this panel on the roundtable on the responsible recycling of metals. And welcome to everybody that's joining the panel online, as well as the people that are here in person. Thank you for attending this panel. A lot of competition this afternoon, but it's good to have you with us. And my name is Dave Knight, and I'm the convener of the roundtable. And I'm going to just introduce my esteemed panelists, and I'll provide a short introduction to the roundtable as well, before getting into some structured questions, and then there will be an opportunity for questions from both the online participants and yourselves in the room as well. At the end, we should have a good kind of 20 minutes, 25 minutes for that. So, so the roundtable on the responsible recycling of metals is a multi-stakeholder initiative that focuses on the responsible production and sourcing of recycled metals. And before I explain a little bit more about the initiative, then please allow me to introduce the panelists, all of whom have been kindly supporting the roundtable as steering group members. So firstly, Marcel Christians, Vice President, Research, Development and Innovation and Sustainability at Wieland KG. And at Wieland, a global specialist in copper and copper alloys, Marcel has the pleasure of leading the teams that develop, guide and execute the Wieland Group's sustainability activities, as well as those that develop the technologies that are the foundation of a sustainable tomorrow. He also serves as Managing Director of Wieland Ventures. And prior to joining Wieland, Marcel has worked in venture capital, led a startup, and worked at a large multinational. Marcel holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. Thanks, Marcel. Welcome. And Michelle Brulhart is the Executive Director of the Copper Mark. The Copper Mark is the leading assurance framework to promote responsible practices across the copper, molybdenum, nickel and zinc value chains. And with over 10 years of experience working on the design, implementation and independent assessment of sustainability standards, Michelle has evaluated and assisted companies at every level of the supply chain, from raw materials to end product and across multiple materials. She was previously the Director of Innovations at the Responsible Minerals Initiative and served as the Head of Auditing at RCS Global for several years. She's also previously held roles focused on responsible sourcing at Underwriter Laboratories, the German Development Corporation, and STR Responsible Sourcing. Thank you, Michelle. Patrick Davison is Managing Director of Mayer Environmental. Mayer Environmental is a specialist waste recycling and resource management consultancy and a wholly owned subsidiary of European Metals Recycling, which operates across North America and Europe. And Patrick is a sustainability and environmental practitioner with over 25 years experience of consultancy within the waste management and recycling sector. He has advised a variety of clients, both public and private, on matters relating to European, UK and regional policy and legislation on circularity, recycling and compliance. He has led many high-profile research projects at a company and sector level, including the establishment of both Ireland and the UK's end-of-life vehicle recycling programs and protocols, the UK steel packaging and the initial WE recycling protocols, and the WRF guidance for metal shredding. And has specialised in the metal recycling sector for most of his career. He's an alumni of Cranfield School of Management and Cambridge University Institute for Sustainable Leadership. Sonia Valdivia, who many of you have already seen on a number of panels. Thank you, Sonia, also for hosting the World Resource Forum. So Sonia is the Scientific Director at the World Resources Forum, and since 2014, Sonia's work has been focused on sustainable recycling industries and life cycle sustainability at the WRF. And since 2016, Sonia is Professor at the Leuphana Universität Lüneburg, associated with the Faculty of Sustainability. She is convener of the ISO standard 59014, which many of you have heard about in other sessions, both this morning and yesterday. Quite a task there, Sonia. And Previously to WRF, Sonia was UNEP Programme Officer and coordinated the Secretariat of the UNEP CTEC Life Cycle Initiative. Sonia has worked for organisations such as UNITAR and the North American Centre for Environmental Cooperation, and as the GIZ coordinator of the Pan-American Network for Environmental Waste Management. She's an academic background in industrial engineering with a PhD in environmental management and policies from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And finally, and if we could perhaps just switch to Tyler on screen. There's Tyler. Hi, Tyler. So Tyler Gillard is the Chief Strategy Officer of the Responsible Business Alliance, and Tyler has recently joined the Responsible Business Alliance and has 20 years of senior level experience in sustainability, supply chains, human rights, stakeholder engagement, and public policy. And the RBA is a non-profit comprised of about 450, possibly more now, Tyler will put us right, electronics, retail, auto and toy companies. The world's largest industrial coalition committed to supporting the rights and well-being of workers and communities worldwide affected by global supply chains. And previously he was head of due diligence at the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct, where he built and led the team that worked with governments and stakeholders to negotiate the OECD's international standards for responsible business conduct. Tyler's worked with policymakers to design regulations on critical minerals, modern slavery, deforestation, sustainability reporting, and responsible supply chain. And the team at OECD worked closely with businesses, trade unions, civil society to strengthen the alignment of industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives. So thank you and welcome, Tyler. Thanks for joining remotely. So if I may just go to these slides, and I'm just going to briefly introduce the Roundtable. So the Roundtable is a multi-stakeholder collaboration that seeks to ensure there's appropriate standards, systems and tools, and that they're available for the responsible production and sourcing of recycled metals. As we move towards circularity, what the Roundtable is seeking to achieve is that there's a similar high level of expectation that we're beginning to see is apparent for primary metals production, and that can be applied through the systems, tools and guidance that's available for the secondary material supply chain. And these are the objectives of the Roundtable. So one of the core objectives is to bring stakeholders together in a multi-stakeholder forum with a safe space to enable sharing and learning, to confirm their needs. We're not setting out to develop a new standard itself. Moreover, we are setting out to develop a roadmap with recommendations that can be considered for adoption by the wider community of both standard voluntary sustainability standard setting organisations, as well as policymakers and other stakeholders. And within that, we're looking to understand and articulate better the risks and impacts of secondary metals value chains. Often under a number of these standards and frameworks, once you've identified that your input materials might be recycled and you can confirm that, then no further due diligence or checks are needed on the impacts and the sources of those materials. So we're also doing a mapping exercise and some landscaping, which I'll mention in a moment. And just to explain a little bit about who's involved, and the panelists are all on the steering group, and there's further steering group members that are shown here, and they've kindly funded the Roundtable and support the Roundtable in various different ways. And we have a broader membership community as well of about another kind of 60 organisations, 70 organisations that are interested in our work. So the kind of activities that we've been doing include initial stakeholder interviews, finding out the needs and understanding the landscape of the secondary metals value chain, mapping work that's looked at a number of the standards, guidelines and legislation in this area. And the kind of objectives that we're seeking are to try to have a common position. Obviously, the scope of metals recycling is so broad that it would be a challenge to look in detail at every particular metal value chain and particular value chain stream. and look at all the risks in detail. And so the intention is that we create a kind of common framework which can then be utilised, and where there's commodity specific needs, then those can then be built upon this common framework. So that kind of common expectation of due diligence, and we're going to be running a more interactive session tomorrow on that. And we're trying to bridge the gap between the downstream users and the small scale, informal and subsistence actors in those supply chains. Okay, so without further ado, then let's get into the questions. So if I can start perhaps by inviting, and could we switch to the other view so that we can see Tyler? Thank you very much. Tyler, the RBA represents many key brands and companies that people will be very familiar with. Perhaps you could first just explain a little bit more about your work, but then what are they asking for? What are the key kind of topics, and how's that changing in regards to recycled materials?
Thank you, Dave. And hello, everybody. I really wish I could be there for the exciting events over the last discussions these last few days. Apologies, I'm not in the room with you. Hopefully I can project my enthusiasm for this topic and the roundtable virtually. So, I mean, it's a really good question. You know, the RBA, the Responsible Business Alliance, as you said, it's over 520 companies worldwide, operating in 120 countries. These companies have 21 million direct employees. So I'm not even talking about their supply chain with over $8 trillion in revenue. So big supply chains that cover every country of the world, and largely, you know, electronics, automotive, aerospace companies with, as you may know, have very complex supply chains. So what are they asking for? Well, they're asking for everything right now. And that's because there's a regulatory avalanche that we're going to hear about. But they've also made a lot of commitments around their supply chain and circular economy. And so for an end user, for an electronics company, for an auto, this issue of responsible recycling comes at both ends of their supply chains. It's on the one hand, the upstream. How are they sourcing metals that enter into their products? You know, we have a lot of experience at the RBA with working with organizations like Coppermark on designing responsible sourcing standards and assurance schemes to make sure that refiners, before that metal enters the supply chain, they're sourcing primary metal responsibly from the mines, that, you know, communities' lives are respected, human rights are respected, the environment is protected. There's less experience, though, in understanding how recycled metal or secondary metal is being sourced. Now, of course, there's a patchwork of regulation that exists to control the export and import of some types of recycled metal or recycled content things. But, you know, from a supply chain perspective, there's not really a lot of visibility. So on the upstream side, companies are looking, one, to understand the recycled content of the products they make, to meet certain recycled content targets for the product, and then at a secondary level, to make sure that the sourcing of you know, recycled secondary material is responsible, that those that are picking through e-waste are not being exposed to harmful chemicals and danger, that child and forced labor is not being used in informal e-waste pickers. So that's on the upstream side. On the downstream side, they also have a responsibility. That means that, of course, automotive and electronics companies have a responsibility for the waste that they generate, how their post-consumer waste. You know, when you think about the waste hierarchy, that companies need to obviously prioritize the reuse and remanufacturing of their products, particularly for things like auto batteries. But the truth of it, a lot of this enters the landfill or is recycled. In the case of electronics, roughly 85% of electronics is recycled through informal markets. So only around 15% is recycled through the formal value chain, through formal recyclers that, let's say, normally would abide by national regulations that might control the export, import, and recycling and health and safety for recycling of e-waste. So e-waste can be particularly hazardous, as we know. It has a lot of, you know, potentially toxic materials, and depending on what you're looking at, the informality of that sector, sort of akin to artisanal small-scale mining, presents massive risks. So companies, I think, when you round it all out, they're looking to make a truly circular supply chain by, on one hand, increasing recycling efficiencies and tracking where their e-waste is going. But on the other hand, meeting certain recycled content targets and ensuring that the source of secondary materials also responsible in terms of protection of the planet and respect for human rights.
And Tyler, why might they have those targets? What kind of things are they trying to achieve by increasing recycled content?
Well, I mean, there's a range of whether it might be sort of resource efficiency and reduced natural resource consumption. There's also a number of emerging regulations that are driving this behavior. For example, the European Union battery regulation that has been recently sort of adopted has a number of requirements, both related to how companies source secondary material for making sure that they do due diligence on that secondary material for respect for human rights. But they also have very specific targets on the product level of the battery that within 5 years, the percentage of nickel, cadmium has to come from recycled sources. So, I mean, there's a regulatory driver, there's clearly an investor driver, that are all sort of coming together and accelerating end user, I think, action and awareness around this issue.
Thank you. And can I invite Patrick, coming at it from a slightly different angle, from the recyclers angle? So I'm guessing that you're kind of helping to serve some of this demand from the manufacturers. What kind of things are they telling you?
Yeah, sure. So EMR, I'll just start talking a little bit about EMR to begin with, so you get a feel for the scope of what we're doing. We recycle about 10 million tonnes a year, so 9 million tonnes of ferrous materials, 1 million tonnes of non-ferrous materials go through our depots each year. That amounts to about £5 billion worth of turnover, so it's quite a large business, large organisation. What we see is demand for information both on the buy side and on the sell side. So when we're trying to secure materials to feed our infrastructure, feed our ecosystem, customers are asking us for information. They want to know, where is it going? Is it being treated appropriately? And what will happen to that material come end of the process? So we're seeing that aspect, and we're having to provide clear guidelines around how much carbon have we expended recycling that material, how much energy have we used. Those two things often seem to be separated. They're interested in biodiversity. What's our impact on biodiversity as well in that space? And then the last thing that we're seeing a lot more of now is social value. So it's going beyond, I think, slightly beyond modern slavery, but they want to see what positive benefits are we providing back to the communities in which we're working. Can we demonstrate that? And if we can do that, then they might be comfortable providing us with their materials. The same on the sell side. Once we've created nice, high quality materials ready for recycling, those buyers want to be comfortable that the materials they're about to procure have come through a legitimate, approved process, compliant process. So we're having to provide much, much more data. So what we're seeing is it's not just a commodity business. We're providing a service now, and that's quite a fundamental change in the way that we view our business operation.
Great, and of course, is there increasing pressure as well to kind of reuse and repurpose materials that you're getting involved in as well? So we respect the fact that, of course, within circular economy, there's higher priorities than recycling, but we want to get that right. But just perhaps you could say a few words on that as well. Yeah, absolutely. So what we've realised is that we can't just have a purely transactional engagement with our suppliers or with the buy side. What we're trying to do now is we're trying to work and collaborate through projects to help design right at the start of the process. So if we're helping them design a car, we can make that car much more readily recyclable. So we're partnering with motor manufacturers, with construction companies, battery manufacturers to get them to get a real good understanding of what is the implication of the way that that item has been made come end of life. Now, what we would like is the ability to reuse, to repair, to allow things to live longer in the economic cycle. But when it does come to end of life, all of those benefits for being able to repair materials help us to get the good stuff out. And that's really where we're trying to move. We're trying to change and collaborate. So we have projects, for example, RecoVas. I don't know whether anybody have come across the RecoVas project. So that's a collaboration with automotive manufacturers to look at batteries come end of life.
What are we going to do with those batteries when they come to end of life? Can we repurpose them initially, for example? So a battery end of life for a vehicle can still act as a very good electrical storage for buildings, for example, or buffering capacity. So we're looking at how do we make that switch? How do we get the value from these materials? And we can only do it by really helping that design side. And most loss of value from recycling is actually designed in, unwittingly, but it's designed in right at the start. If we're using things like epoxy resins, glues, those sorts of things, they completely mess with the system. And a certain amount of it is us understanding, well, what is being used now to build these items? Because we know come 15 years' time, that's when the current stock of cars, the peak we will see, will come through our ecosystem for recycling. So it's what's happening today. We need to understand that for 15 years' time. It's a long game.
Thank you. And we've already heard that 85% of electronics are heading towards informal streams at the end of their lives. It's very problematic materials. Of course, across metals, there's a great variation in terms of the recycling rates and the different opportunities there. But perhaps, Sonia, you can help us understand the nature and extent of some of these impacts, because it feels to me that recycling has got a kind of warm glow about it, and that a lot of times the impacts are kind of overlooked. And obviously it's good to focus on primary production where there's considerable impacts, but what's the kind of nature and extent of the impacts within the recycling value chain?
Thank you, Dave, for the question, and thanks for this very good opportunity to communicate on these very important topics with this excellent panel. So on the impacts, we have been hearing about the international global aspect of these value chains. I mean, it's not just in one country, it's not just in one region. We're talking about this globalized value chain where we have raw materials coming from one region, going to another one to be assembled, but then consumed somewhere else. And at the end of the day, there are transboundary movements. So we see then slowly the stakeholders or the value chain with actors, key actors all over the world. So the impacts, depending, of course, on the regions, are diverse. I was thinking about classifying them. We talk a lot about the social and environmental impacts. One group that we do not address or spell out so clearly is the governance one. Governance is about touches upon regulation, upon also structures, cultures, depending on how the ecosystems in the places are organized. I think this is a very important one that we need to look more into. By the way, we start talking about whether it's subsistence activity or informal sector, because let's not say that it's the same. And this is an important term and approach that we are addressing, for example, in standards and recommendations that we try to communicate and develop together with stakeholders. So this is one aspect. Then we have the socioeconomic aspect. It depends whether it's the activities are happening in regions and countries with stronger infrastructures or regulations better established and enforced. Then this prevents less of these uncontrolled impacts at socioeconomic level, but also at the environmental level. But if it's not the case, then you typically see these dramatic cases of uncontrolled practices. And there you see from child labor through gender aspects. So this is what I would like to highlight. We could talk a bit more about the environmental aspects as well. Perhaps to highlight on the hazardous substances or the chemical impacts, but this is case specific. It would depend obviously on the type of source of products that are being handled. Maybe with this, I would like just maybe to provoke the ideas on the first summary on what the impacts are along the value chain. And yeah, can elaborate further depending on the questions.
Yeah, thank you. And Michelle, perhaps you can also kind of expand on the nature and extent of these impacts and what we know and what we don't understand about them, because they're very widespread, but often kind of for certain users of the end products, they might not be actually that aware of some of these impacts.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dave. And I think Sonia's already highlighted the fact that a lot of this is very diverse, very different depending on the supply chain, the metal, the product that you're looking at, the geography that you're looking at. And so I think the first thing to note is just that there's a whole lot that we don't know, which is, I think, why from the Coppermark side, we felt the roundtable was really a needed step to try and understand better what are some of these nuances, what are some of these differences in terms of e-waste versus other metals versus precious metals, et cetera. So what are the kinds of risks or impacts that we're looking at in the value chain? And so, I think we already heard, questions about recycled content, questions about carbon. So equally, what are the kind of drivers that customers send in terms of the information they're looking for isn't necessarily about a social impact or subsistence or informal economy, but it's more motivated by information about reduction of carbon footprint of a product, which again may or may not align with the risk profile of a supply chain, or may not align with other ESG impacts. And so I think there's a whole lot to untangle when it comes to ESG, to environmental, social, and governance impacts in recycled metal supply chains, starting really with a better understanding of, why are we asking about these impacts? What are we actually trying to understand? Are we just trying to understand the carbon footprint? Are we trying to understand human rights impacts? Are we looking at end-of-life material that's coming back into the supply chain, which is a different risk profile than what we call pre-consumer scrap, right? Or materials that are waste from manufacturing processes and then go back into manufacturing processes, either in the same way or in a different way. That comes with a whole lot of different sort of risk and, again, impact profiles. And so I think just even understanding what are the metals we're looking at, and what is the type of recycled material that we're looking at. And then the second step, but I think one of the major challenges that we have in recycled supply chains is the lack of transparency, which is not uncommon in supply chains, and certainly is also not something that has been fully achieved with primary raw materials. But in recycled materials, we see there's a lot of a real gap in terms of transparency beyond even just that first immediate supplier, of understanding where's that coming from. Again, does it come from the scrapyard next doors, or does it come from the other side of the planet? Again, sort of different impacts, different risks associated with these kinds of supply chains. And so, I don't think we're at the stage where we're really able to say this is the extent to which we have these impacts in recycled supply chains, because we are not at the stage yet where we are comparing apples with apples, and where we're really clear about what it is that we're looking at and what it is that we're trying to understand. And so there's a bit of homework to do before I think we can confidently go out and speak to impacts of recycled metal supply chains.
Thank you. Marcel, perhaps I can just ask you to pick up on the kind of pre and post-consumer differences, because in a number of the standard and guidelines that are there, everything just gets bundled together as recycled. But as Michelle has articulated, there's some considerable differences.
Sure.
And
yeah, and I just wanted to, first of all, the Wieland Group is a company that not everyone knows, but you all have part of Wieland on or around you. So within your phones, I mean, the copper that we sell is part of your computers, part of your glasses, part of the pipes in your house. So it really is something that you don't really think about it, but the copper really is all around you. And coming back to why recycling is something that's so important. We touched on the economic side of it. The environmental side of it in terms of reducing product carbon footprint, in terms of making sure that from an other societal impact, et cetera, all of that is taken care of. But at the end of the day, in a couple of years, we actually won't have enough primary metal, copper in particular, to be able to satisfy demands of growing economies. So this is fundamentally one of the important messages that we need to focus on, that really makes a huge impact on how we're going to be able to develop going forward, you know, if we're not able to secure supply. So both us as a company that processes metals, but also as consumers, you know, we as individual consumers, if we're not able to, you know, to actually purchase the things that we want to use, et cetera, that have these metals, this is a fundamental, one of key aspects. Now, then that leads me into the pre and post consumer part of it. So pre-consumer, so basically waste metal that comes from before it gets to the consumer. This is actually fairly well known within metals, and how we handle that is actually fairly mature, because at the end of the day, everyone knows that this is, you know, there's a lot of value in these. So being, you know, there's no point in throwing this metal away. We can just be remelted and reused. So that part of it, I would say, is a fairly well understood part of how we do business with our customers. And it's a fairly mature, because the way that we transact and that we're able to recover that metal, or that we're able to supply it, whether you're looking at it from a recycler or whether you're looking at it from the processor perspective, at the end is a standard methodology. When we were talking about post-consumer, which we're really talking about diverting waste from landfills, et cetera, this is where it's really, really important to be able to focus on. And I mean, we've seen things in the past couple of months. I mean, you hear about it a lot in terms of the incentives that happen when you're dealing with high value metals. You know, you see it a lot in, for example, in South Africa. With a couple of months ago, there was a really interesting article about this gentleman, or, you know, this person that was actually stripping copper wires, and the whole incentive of how that the organized crime that's built up around high value metals. And it's very difficult, because wire chops look, you know, you don't know where the wire chops came from. The moment you melt them, you also don't know if you get little ingots, do they come from someone actually risking their lives trying to chop that down, or is it actually come from a reputable source? So it's not just talking about whether it comes from the scrap dealer next door, but actually where that is being collected and how that is processed.
Yeah, so we're seeing these significant kind of gap in information, and perhaps you can expand on, you know, is there sufficient information flowing through that value chain, in particular around these post-consumer sources, to enable you to make decisions and understand those risks?
So I think, if I had to give a short answer, there probably isn't enough information that's coming in, and because the processes are just not established enough. And as we also expand the scope of collection, we do need to get a little bit better about making sure that as you start going into smaller and smaller scrap piles, you know, that you're able to trace that all along. At the end of the day, there are regulatory, from country to country it differs, but there's a regulatory environment that at least helps us to try to avoid the most, let's say, grossest incentives into, you know, criminal behaviors. For example, limiting cash payments to a maximum of 10,000. So things, you know, you're seeing that in the aluminum industry. You're seeing that also, you know, in the steel industry, where there's a limitation. You know, you have to provide identification. You need to provide when you're at the collection point. You're starting to see those things. But at the end of the day, there is still some liability there that would be something that would make the entire value chain a lot more comfortable, trying to understand that no one is exposing themselves on a business perspective to too much risk going forward as you increase the recycled content.
And so there's considerable kind of business ethics and
Correct.
risks and criminality as well within those value chains that is having a significant impact.
Absolutely.
The whole way through the value chain. Okay. And Michelle, perhaps I could ask you the same question. So from the Copper Marks perspective, and perhaps you could just expand a little bit more on the Copper Marks role and how it tries to provide assurance, and then asking you the same question around this flows of information and what you would like to see and how we can start to gain more confidence and to close those information gaps.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, in my ideal world, I would see a whole lot more information about recycled metal supply chains flow through the chain. I think I am sitting here because we, at the Copper Mark, we started a little idealistically, going out there and saying, let's do due diligence on recycled metal supply chains. And so I've got a huge amount of pushback. This was a few years back now.
Perhaps you could just explain due diligence a little bit.
So due diligence as in, we said you should go out and try to understand where your recycled material comes from. And you should try to understand what are the associated environmental, social, and governance risks with the sources that you have for your recycled material. We didn't go out and say you need to, trace it back all the way through the entire chain, but we said, you should start engaging with your suppliers. You should start looking at asking questions, saying to your local scrap suppliers, where did you collect this from? Where is this from? Start to understand again, sort of, does it come from your country? Has it been imported from other sources, etc.? What's the composition? And you do that because you're trying to understand, as I said, the risks associated, the impacts associated with those supply chains. And I think, throughout, for about a year, the response that we got unanimously was to say, this is complicated. We don't know where things are coming from. This is very complex. These supply chains are very complex, And so we started kind of slowly and surely engaging more. I think one of the big challenges we still have and we still see is honestly is engaging the recycling industry. So I'm really pleased to have Patrick here with us in the panel, because I think, there's a lot of talk about the recycling industry, not a huge amount of engagement with the recycling industry on these questions. There's these different sort of, standards landscapes, standards around responsible sourcing, regulations around recycled content, ISO standards in the recycling industry, but they're not really connecting, they're not really talking to each other. And so frankly, a big challenge has been just trying to engage more with recyclers, trying to engage more with the recycling industry to understand, well, why is it complex? What are the barriers to understand, to have more transparency in your supply chain? What are the barriers for that data flow? And I think that's brought us to my point earlier made on, there's a lot of different scenarios, right? There is sort of sectors within the recycling industry where it's not that complicated and where there is enough data and there's enough data that flows in the supply chain. And there are other sectors where it is very complicated and it's going to be very challenging if you receive, a ton of scrap from all over the place to figure out where exactly is each of that little bit of scrap now coming from. And so again, I think we have quite a bit of way ahead of us there.
And perhaps we could explore some of those barriers a little bit more. We're in Geneva and Switzerland, and the home of a number of key trading organisations, and the business models of some of those trading organisations they're not always conducive to sharing sources of materials. Is that something? And I'll open this up to the wider panel. What are the kind of barriers that you're finding, and are you able to get that information? But Michelle, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, I think first off, nobody's asked the question, right? If the customer's not asking where this is coming from, then why would you go and try and find the information? So I think that's where it really starts, that where responsible sourcing has started in primary materials as well, with regulation and with regulations being in place and customers asking, where did you get this from? I need more information, and that cascading down in the value chain. And we haven't necessarily seen that same level of engagement. It's slowly starting. I think companies like Wieland are, leading in the space and more actively asking and engaging, but we're not seeing this as being a sort of common market expectation across all recycled metal supply chains yet.
So we need to change that. Marcel?
Yeah, I think, we're seeing it now from our customers or our customers' customers as well, when we're starting to engage in N-tier mapping, where they're really trying to go all the way up to mine, or at least the source of where the material comes from, where even on a primary perspective, it's actually quite difficult to be able to say where specific ore came from, once it's, because there's a lot of trading of ore, which is it becomes a little bit fungible as well. But even more so once you're starting to get into recycled content or scrap material, where it's actually we get to the point where we're able to go up to a certain point of the supply chain, but then when you're trying to go back one further, there's just not enough information, and that point is actually not good enough for customers' expectations in the future. So right now, everyone understands, but the message already is the pressure from let's say from our customers already is that this is something that we need to improve drastically as we go forward.
Okay, and Tyler, can I bring you in here as well to just take that kind of the customer perspective? Some of these brands, you know, are they kind of wanting to close that information gap?
Yeah, well, undoubtedly, I think there is a hunger for understanding where the material is coming from and the provenance, the origin, and the quality of that material, but as well as is it produced responsibly. I think the real challenge is that the pressures on end users are coming in all directions for all things. So whether we want to admit it or not, recycling is just one of a long list of pressures that a electronics or auto company has to face when thinking about their supply chains. You know, emerging supply chain due diligence legislation. So, you know, Michelle spoke about due diligence. That's the process by which companies, you know, identify and address, you know, environmental and human rights risk in their supply chain. And they do this by mapping supply chains, collecting information, doing kind of a risk-based approach to checking, which is starting with everybody, but then looking at country or sector risk to kind of narrow it down to then the product, and then maybe deploying audits or site level checks in their supply chain, you know. And but the emerging legislation is really rightfully so expecting companies to do this end-to-end supply chain for all types of risks. So that means that recycled material, particularly if you're in electronic or auto, is just one of hundreds of things that they're kind of forced to think about. But I will say that, you know, the RBA a few years ago already with some support did some mapping of what our members' data exchange and material info requirements were. And, you know, unsurprisingly, we found one, everyone is asking for a lot of information, but it's totally uncoordinated and incomparable. And this is where we are right now. It's kind of like the 19th century weights and measurements problem when we didn't all harmonize our approach to pounds and kilograms and ounces. So if, you know, we can't convey information if we're all measuring things differently. And, you know, I'm not a data scientist, but obviously definitions and standardization of what we're looking for is quite critical. And, you know, one of the things that's driving this as well, and I think where we're challenged is, you know, I think industries are sort of used to, I've come to accept that they need to collaborate within their sector. You know, they're sort of like, you know, this is pre-competitive or it's competitive, but we need to work together to do this. The new reality is inter-industry collaboration between sectors, between recycling and between miners and between metal producers and manufacturers and battery manufacturers and auto all together. And that's in order to come up with a common language. And, you know, we are definitely not there yet, whether it's for primary or secondary. And you know, there are a lot of benefits to recycling. You know, we know that. I don't want to just like kind of, you know, pile on and say recycling is all bad. Obviously, recycling is where we need to go. Also, from the economic standpoint that Marcel mentioned, we need to diversify. We need to hedge against some of the also political risk that's happening globally, where access to resources are really being held to question. So it is incredibly important, but we need to collaborate across the industry. And every time we go into a new industry, this is my experience at the OECD at least, it's sort of like, oh, we're exceptional, we're different, we're complex, and we're doing enough. That's always the response. It doesn't matter which industry you get to, is we're exceptional, we're different, we're doing enough, you don't understand, leave us alone. And I think we need to overcome that through dialogue and saying, you know, this is not me end users imposing on recyclers. It's a dialogue to see what's possible. I think Patrick talked about how important their input is in order to help, you know, OEMs, manufacturers actually manufacture things better so that they can be reused and remanufactured.
Thank you. So, and this is what the roundtable is about. It's creating this collaborative space to be able to have some of these conversations and to link things up, because they're heading in many different directions and it's incredibly complex, as we've heard. And I'd like to just explore a little bit more about the legislation, what's driving this, and to link up some of the themes that we've been hearing across these different sessions. But would any of the other panelists like to talk about some of the barriers and challenges of some of this information, and maybe from the subsistence level, getting that kind of information to flow further up? Please.
Yes, maybe I start introducing where do we come from with subsistence activities. So we are developing a standard, an ISO standard within the umbrella of the technical committee on circular economy. And this specific standard is for the sustainability and traceability of secondary materials recovery. So there it's really precisely talking about this need of information. Of course, sustainability aspects are the core to be understood, to be communicated. And I think what I have been hearing, we are aiming at trying to respond to these needs. And this is a collaborative process with the stakeholders, with civil society representatives, companies representing, for example, steel companies that use scrap and others. So I think I like very much, that's why when we started this joint work with the Roundtable, that it's the perfect match to work together and collaborate. Subsistence activities there, it's about the group of individuals, but also, well, as association, micro recyclers. It depends on the context, how they are named, that are surviving, are earning the minimum to subsist through the activities that correspond the recycling of, in that case, secondary materials. It can be metals. This is an important flow, but we can also talk about other secondary material flows. And this is not yet well understood and defined in many regulations, we have to say. In many cases, you only hear about the informal sector, which is even a bit more complicated and confusing, because you find it in different countries addressed differently. Sometimes they are considered even illegal. And this shouldn't be the case, because the same activities happening in another country are accepted here and criminalized somewhere else. So there you see the complexity. That's why we are now talking about subsistence activities. And this has been well accepted by our stakeholder, but our members in the ISO process that, well, we have countries, we have civil society participants, companies from a diverse constitution and information. We have proposed also a collection of data that we believe, that was agreed, can be transferred from one stakeholder to the next. In that case, from the collection side, for example, to the recycler. And this is what we are proposing in the standard that we are going to publish next year. It's undergoing the consultation very soon, and I'm happy to share it with you, Dave, because there is still a bit of a gap, an opportunity for commenting, and that would address a bit this need to collaborate and to coordinate efforts. This is going to happen until December.
And do you see a role for states and authorities in order to help collate some of this information that we're talking about from the collection, and in particular in the post-consumer space? You know, which kind of actors need to be involved in helping to collect that data and to pass it on?
Well, the standard itself needs to be published first. Now the period is for commenting on what's going to be published. And there you see the relevance of trying to address if there is a concern or a point that you would need to see in the standard. We can discuss, of course. But then later when it's issued, it's up to the organizations. And we already see a number of organizations, we don't say piloting the standard, but we say assessing the feasibility. And obviously some of them are metal recyclers. So there is already an attempt to try to understand that part, but the data itself, if it's going to become a database, it's a bit too early to say, but definitely we are talking about upstream and downstream. This is also a bit broader than due diligence, only upstream. we aim at also understanding what impacts would be after the product has been released to the market, for example. And we're talking about the end of life, I mean, all these aspects, then linked to the extended producer responsibility, for example.
Okay, thank you. And so in many of the sessions, we've also heard about some of the drivers that are coming to try to close this information gap. And Patrick, perhaps I can invite you just to talk a little bit about how legislation is changing and how that can be used also to close this information gap and the implications on industry of some of the changing kind of regulatory landscape.
Yeah, sure. I think whether it sounds strange to say this, but in the UK we have a lot of regulation, same as in Europe. We're following the same processes and protocols. It's actually quite a good thing for us because it does allow us to operate and trade at a particular framework. So, for example, we can't pay for scrap with cash. It has to go through some third-party transaction. That means that we have to have ID then from anybody who's trading with us. Now, even trying to get that information and have that data is a challenge. So how we get data from other locations, I just don't know. I'd love to be able to say I have the answers, I don't. But it's when we look at that framework, we look at the legislation, the requirements, it's incredibly inconsistent. So if data is needed and required, what is the market going to pay us for providing that information? It sounds, I'm an environmentalist, but I work for a corporate a business. So there has to be some value associated with that material. There has to be some value associated with the data. From a legislation point of view, what we are seeing are complexities. Again, in Europe, scrap metal is viewed as a waste. In the US, it's not. So it means that we fall under a lot of EU regulation around waste. That is a challenge for us. So we are viewed as a waste processing business. We're viewed as a business that generates waste. I would argue we don't. What we do is we pass waste through ourselves, we condense it, we change it, and we release those materials back into the marketplace. We're concentrating down some of the problematic materials so we can deal with them more readily rather than having them dispersed. That's a challenge for us. That is a real issue. And it becomes very difficult then to separate some of the challenging materials from the metals. So I was having a conversation earlier around persistent organic pollutants in plastics. They're associated with metals. We get them in cabling and such like. So what are we expected to do with those materials once they land within our ecosystem? We have to do something with that. It's expensive. So how do we manage that? How do we make sure that that is reflected in both in our operations, but also reflected in the market value for the materials when it comes through? In some respects, I think there's some really interesting legislation, some great legislation coming through for metals recyclers. And I think some of that is, for example, the ELV directive, the redraft of that. So they're going to compel manufacturers to use recycled content in new vehicles. Now, from our point of view, that's fantastic. We've had producer responsibility for quite some time. But again, producer responsibility distorts the market. What we have is we are compelled to recover, recycle 95% of every vehicle. So we put a lot of effort in to do that. Now, we then put that material onto the market, but there's no compulsion then for manufacturers to take that material, buy it, and then put it into their own products. With the redraft of the LV regulations, we're hoping we will see that change. And there will therefore be a demand for the material that we've generated and spent a lot of time. We still have issues with things like waste classification. Again, legislation has been there for a long time, but the interpretation changes. So we're finding now, for example, in the UK, we have a change to the regulatory position that the Environment Agency would have around shredder classification. So it used to be non-hazardous, now it's hazardous material. So we're having to treat that quite differently. What it also means is there's a regulatory burden again. We have to modify all of our permits. We have to change all of our regulatory systems, processes, operations to allow us to actually treat and process that material. And the more material we want to get out, the more effort we have to put in. So if we're just measuring it purely on carbon basis, it looks worse. The more effort we put in, the more energy we have to expend. It makes us look worse as an operator. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the best value out of the materials that we have. So regulatory point of view, it's not all bad. The challenge we have with it is consistent application and consistent enforcement. If we don't have that, it's not a fair playing field for us to be able to operate. And what it doesn't allow us to do is then de-risk CapEx investment. So there's a significant risk. It's expensive to process some of the materials that we have. Consistent regulation will mean that we can have a really good understanding of what's coming at us from over the horizon. Therefore, we can invest, and therefore we can get the most out of the materials that we're receiving.
Great. So we're hearing that there's even difficulty in defining simple things like waste,
Yes.
origin, source, and all those kind of things. So we really do need to kind of come together around these things to enable us to make progress. Now, Tyler, can I just put that question to you around the legislative environment, how things are changing? And for me, it also seems like some pieces of legislation, are they all pulling in the same direction? There seems to be a bit of a kind of land grab for raw materials, critical raw materials legislation, etc. But then you've also got this need to understand a lot more about the origins. And so anyway, please, what are the regulatory drivers?
Well, I mean, I think, and then they're certainly not at all fully aligned. And zooming out a little bit from Patrick's focus on specific regulations that focus on waste and recycling on supply chains, there's an enormous amount of emerging or existing legislation around, for example, in the United States under the Tariff Act, there is a prohibition on import of goods made with forced labor. That has kind of received renewed impetus for enforcement of late, with also a specific regulation for focusing on alleged Uyghur forced labor. And I think if you look at Europe, has been really the kind of center for supply chain legislation on environmental and human rights issues. So, they're in the latest stages of Europe of negotiating a corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which would apply to companies in all sectors for all types of environmental human rights issues. And it calls on companies to check their supply chains, both directions, prioritize risks based on the severity of their harm, and then take action to address those risks. So, that sounds like a simple process. And I'm, in my previous hat, sort of responsible for making it sound simpler than perhaps it is. But, when we think about prioritizing issues, that's where you get to trade-offs. And I think no policymaker, let alone a consumer, let alone a business, wants to kind of face the reality that, climate improvements may come with a social cost, or vice versa. These things, there are going to be trade-offs, there are dilemmas, things need to be addressed first. Now, who decides what is more important? Is it waste to an environment? Is it the subsistence workers? Is it the union busting activity? Is it the child labor? All of those things are important. So, what we really need, and what the legislation I think is pushing towards, is transparency. The issue is, of course, that how governments define the specifics, the details, really matters when we think about exchanging information and working across borders to address these issues. Just to give you a concrete example, due diligence by general, regulatory approaches is a kind of obligation of process. Companies need to put in place processes to manage the risk. A lot of the forced labor stuff that's emerging is a ban on goods made with forced labor. So stuff can be withheld at the border, or what's being proposed in Europe on forced labor, withdrawn from the market if it's made wholly or in part with forced labor. So even if there's reasonable evidence to assume that maybe the e-waste picker was in a situation of bonded labor, then that is 12 tiers up the supply chain. That good could actually be withdrawn. That car, that battery could be withdrawn from the market or not allowed to be imported. So it's kind of very different approaches that we're seeing. I guess the other bucket that I should speak to, of course, is reporting legislation, which is kind of a bit more mature, but also not consistent. So the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive has been sort of updated with a massive kind of range of 200 and something indicators that businesses should report against. Those are very different than the reporting expectations in the United States, let alone emerging markets like China, Shanghai, Singapore, which have very advanced ESG reporting, but are also different. So again, I mean, we get onto this differential, kind of approaches across regulation, and hence the need, in my view, for the roundtable. The problem is that businesses can't just wait for this stuff to be worked out. A year for definitions to sort of come out through a consensus process. So that's the sort of challenge, because businesses are on the hook now with meeting and complying with the law, but the processes that we need to build consensus across industries take years. And I think that's part of also the challenge that we're at right now.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. We really do need to act with speed and scale. And some of the mechanisms that we've got to do that include some of the voluntary sustainability schemes. So, Michelle, perhaps you can help us understand how they might be adapting in order to meet some of these needs, and how can we move faster?
Yeah, I think as with everything that we sort of touched upon, there is complexity and sort of a range of different sustainability standards and voluntary standards there as well. I think one of the elements that really could benefit from more collective thought and action is around what are the expectations for responsible sourcing or for due diligence for recycled materials. How far back do you need to go? How do you identify risks? I think with, in primary materials, we have some really good sector guidances that have very clearly defined what they call red flags, very clearly defined aspects to look for that could indicate a higher risk situation in supply chains. And then to Tyler's point, that will help you prioritize as a company where to look for. We don't have that in recycled material supply chains. So I think that's something that really could benefit from a bit of collective action because it can be retranslated, reintegrated across different sustainability standards afterwards, right? Then it can be said, regardless of the standard that you're using, there's a shared expectation of what it is that you're looking for, what are the processes that you're expected to put in place. I think we also, and this is maybe a bit of a maturity curve, right? We are seeing a lot of industry metal specific kind of calculation methods, definitions, guidance emerge. And I think that's going to be a natural evolution where they will come back together at some point, but we do have to go through the stage of the industry sort of sitting together and saying, okay, for us, this is what it means, and these are the definitions, and we'll see kind of more commonalities emerge.
And can I just check, well, do you mean for things like greenhouse gas measurement or?
For example, right, even just kind of where do you set this, how do you define the system's boundaries if you want to calculate recycled content for a product, right? But what's the standard that you're following in that regard? What's the, are you using the ISO definition for pre and post consumer scrap? Or are you using a different definition? So we're seeing a lot of that being developed. But as always in standards, it's sort of in that early stage where it feels like a bit of a mushrooming of all sorts of different initiatives coming together, and that will need to come back and consolidate into some sort of shared language, shared definitions, shared expectations, which then needs to be integrated into the existing voluntary and sustainability standards that are already out there, whether they're specific to recycling or whether they're specific to certain value chains or specific to certain metals or certain stages within the value chain. I think that's where we're trying to connect the dots a bit more.
Okay. Marcel, would you like to kind of expand on your use of standards and what you would like to see and how that's potentially changing, and whether you'd like to get kind of a bit better frameworks to enable that information?
Well, I mean, we're very much fans of trying to standardize, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to make, what we all would like to do is to make sure that doing the right thing is also the easiest thing to do. So what we as a company are also trying to do via, whether it's the Copper Mark or actually being here as part of the roundtable, is showing how some of these best practices and trying to simplify the work that we're doing, trying to standardize, can actually make industries just work a little bit better because there's a shared sense of definition. So specifically one of the things that we've been working on, and you mentioned it just now, was definitely just setting, what is recycled content, and what is pre-post, and where are the system boundaries that we should that we should draw around companies, to be able to define that, what's waste and what's a byproduct and what's run around when, what can be internally reused versus not. So these things that, potentially sound somewhat simple and trivial when you have a very simple process flow within a company, kind of collapse and become actually very difficult to handle once you have parts of your companies are, further upstream or downstream, or when you're already, part of a larger conglomerate where these things do differ. So that's definitely, we see that working through associations, working through standards really is an accelerant. So even though right now it's a lot of work, it's the right thing to do to actually, in the longer term perspective, you're putting in the work now because it'll pay off longer term. Just in general.
And Sonia, the international framework provides that opportunity to try to kind of bring this together as well. Perhaps you could expand on, because that's a tricky challenge that you have sat in that the hot seat, trying to enable a consensus to come out of the process. Perhaps you could expand on your views on the opportunities there, some of the successes that you've had, but also whether that provides that platform for more kind of international solid kind of definitions.
Thank you, Dave. I believe in this kind of processes. Perhaps I have a quick, a very burning question. How many of you sitting in the room have worked on ISO standards or international standards in general?
Okay.
Like, yes, 30%. How many of you are using or are happy to use these international standards? So we see that this is already a language that is being promoted and is being used and applied. They follow international or national processes with stakeholders that represent the different views. So there is a huge opportunity there. I believe in that. I think perhaps what we need is more the coordination of us. I don't see any risk now in saying, no, we are duplicating efforts. I don't see that. But what I see is more the coordination on key areas, definitions. I have to say also something on ISO, not because we are doing with some of you that I know in the room, thanks for coming, we are doing the ISO standard together. It's not because of that, but it's because, especially in developing countries, due to the lack, in many cases, of proper enforcement of what is already available, ISO play a higher role, are really better used, seen. It's not like a duplicated tool. It's more like the tool that you use because this is working, even though it's voluntary. So there use that potential. It's not the same as in Europe probably, or as in the USA, where there's a number of guidelines and standards, but there it many times is the only thing that is there. So I really appeal to that because it's also of advantage for the sectors. And there I can only say, we have here the civil society and everybody represented, so we work together.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to take a quick opportunity to remind you online as well that you can post some questions through the app if you have questions for the panelists, because we're coming towards the end of the session. So we should have some time at the end just to take some questions and also, of course, for you here. Okay, so just to kind of change tack a little bit and look at the opportunities we have to improve material supplies. So getting better quality material can lead to improvements in many things, in reductions in embodied carbon, etc. Perhaps you can just help us all understand what's changing in that space. And Patrick, I'll come to you first.
I think the design aspect, I mean, I alluded to it earlier, the design aspect of materials is absolutely critical for us to generate a quality of material coming through the recycling system. So for example, the I always go back to an ELV. It's a complex item, so it's quite a handy thing to think about. If we look at just the general composition makeup of an end-of-life vehicle, we worked through, we think there's probably 200 different types of plastic polymers, somewhere around about that sort of level, maybe 15 types of aluminium, various other alloys that are included. Then we've got glues, epoxy resins, things like that in that particular item. Now, if we narrowed that down to 4 or 5 plastics, it may not look quite as nice, it might not feel quite as nice, but the recyclability of that vehicle goes up enormously. If we then start thinking about replacing some of those items within the vehicle with metals, for example. So one of the classics we find is glass fiber polypropylene. So that's a nightmare to recycle. It's a nightmare to recover. Messes up our systems because of the density differences. If we could replace that with, say, some aluminium or some magnesium, and we simplify the alloys that are used, it will make life a lot easier for us. So that quality of material is really important. I think it goes to the point as well around post-consumer, post-production. Post-consumer is incredibly complex, incredibly difficult to get the materials out. Now, if we lose post-consumer because consumers want to keep that material, we're losing the cream in the process. It becomes really expensive for us to actually try and maximize the materials. So by simplifying what we're using right from the start really helps us. What we're also doing is thinking about what we do with items come end of life. So, for example, I'm running a research piece at the moment on buildings, demolition, construction. So typically when a building comes to end of life, we knock it down, we smash it up, and then we segregate everything afterwards. What we'd like to do is think about a model whereby we can dismantle a building. So if we can take a building apart, then we can see whether we've got reusable items in there, reusable steels, for example. We can take those items, sell them again for their original purpose. It's a great idea. But contractually, what we find is that builders and demolition contractors have got a very limited period of time to actually knock the building down. They've got to get it down, get the site cleared so that the new building can go up as fast as possible. So the equivalent of helping or trying to influence design of new products like an ELV is working with law firms and solicitors who are writing these contracts right from the start. So they're actually writing in and building in sustainability into those contracts, thinking about, right, the resource that sits within that particular building, can we get it out? If we're given a longer period of time, can we map it and then realise those materials, realise the true value of those materials come end of life? So that quality, when it arrives through our door, is fantastic. You know, we love a nice, clean scrap material to come in. It means that we can actually generate a really nice, clean quality material to be sold on to melters and refiners. The mixture of materials, the complexity that we have out there, the numbers of alloys, the numbers of complex materials and the way we've built them and put them together, it just makes that a real headache for us, an absolute headache.
So here, I mean, potentially that, you know, that looking at different parts of the value chain, one of the things that happens from a recycler perspective, you know, going to smelters or other refiners and, you know, recycling facilities, is just part of the business model of taking a specific grade. You know, if you're just a little bit under in terms of percentage, you know, you put in a bit of cathode or whatever to get it up. And then that actually ends up being quite a bit of a nightmare because you don't really know, you know, you're paying for, let's say, whatever, 80% material content. But, you know, a lot of that, if you were truly, you know, to segregate it, you know that it's coming, the majority of the value is coming from from let's say, pure metal. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you're now going to have to figure out. How do you handle that to be able to process it, to be able to get back up to cathode quality? So I think that's from the perspective of the business model of being able to actually go from selling batches or selling, you know, into doing more inline. You're paying for what you're actually receiving on a continuous basis. So the technology required to be able to do, you know, online and inline verification of what the material is specifically rather than on a batch level. I think that's going to be something that would be very beneficial on the upstream side of what happens on a smelter or you know, refining facility. Then the second part also already now at the refiners would be what happens when you have chemically bound or two metals that are that are bound chemically that are not easy to separate. So now that is one of the things that being able to, if you're able to separate those two metals and sell them individually, that's a lot more valuable than actually being able to shred, to say, okay, now we know that we have tin copper or some copper with an electroplated layer of tin. And then so you're seeing a lot of innovation today right now. I mean, obviously you can do it via pyro. That generates even more waste via scrap, via slag, and then how do you process the slag, etc. But then, so you're actually seeing that a lot of innovation today in hydrometallurgy, and this is actually one of those interesting places where you have environmental impact in terms of chemicals, but if you're able to close the loop in terms of your process, actually the end product both is less energy intensive, and you're able to really select the materials that you're getting out, getting better value for everyone.
So Tyler, can I just take that to you in terms of things like digital material passports, and also the question around simplifying products? Is that something that your members are keen to pursue?
I mean, if you try to, we have two bits of work at the RBA that deals with this topic. One is our Responsible Minerals Initiative that has been mentioned, and that's dealing with the sourcing of the materials upstream, So what's going on there? There's a lot happening, and a lot of this we want to be able to do in a consultative way through the Roundtable and others. But one is just updating the information we have on certain materials and adding basic info like largest importers, exporters of scrap, end of life recycling rates. As sort of others have alluded to, even that basic info is actually quite difficult to get or at least credible information at a kind of macro by material level. We're also now looking into how our smelter refiner standards can be updated to include something around sourcing of secondary content. So this is an early process, and we want to use whatever comes out of the Roundtable to inform that. But it is really fundamental. And then the question is, how is that information upstream going to be, transferred? We have something called, minerals reporting templates. So basically, I don't want to go too in the weeds here, but when you think about traceability end to end, there are certain pieces of information that we need to have, but there's certain information that can be aggregated at sort of pinch points in the supply chain and shared on. So, for example, when you're thinking about sourcing of mined material, companies at the end of the supply chain don't really need to know the mine of origin for all the metals in their products and all the complex alloys. What they need to know is that the processor and smelter is sourcing responsibly and that is checked, so that there's common but differentiated responsibilities, but everyone's doing their job. So we need to figure out what that same level of info is for recycling, but right now that's collected through these reporting templates that is aggregated by suppliers at each stage in the supply chain and shared on. So eventually we're going to need to add on info like recycled content at the smelter refiner facility at an annual production, at a share of annual production. Origin, high risk origin in aggregate of that facility. And that is then aggregated and shared. You touched on something before, Dave, though. There is a culture in general, particularly at some of these pinch points, whether it's a commodity trader, of not wanting to share the supplier lists. And that's understandable difficulty to kind of overcome. But I think there are ways to share in protected environments. And there's also just a little bit of the sky's not going to fall in if we do share this. That, companies, whether you're a trader or a processor, need to have enough trust in your own value added activity that just by sharing your supplier list, your customers aren't going to bypass you. No, they still need you to be an aggregator, a distributor, whatever it might mean. So I think that's on the upstream side. Downstream, our members have made a lot of commitments to their circular economy and recuperation. So a lot of and I want to note that only about 15% of the RBA members are brands. The rest are contract manufacturers making components. But out of the brands, many have made major commitments, but are struggling to track it. So they are investing themselves in recycling. If you look at, for example, Apple, they have made massive investments in recycling themselves and bought recyclers in order to do the things that they're not able to sort of do by tracking it down the supply chain. So, you know, there is a need there. Members are trying to do it. It really differs between electronic products and auto. Auto is much more on the hook because it's just a bigger, heavier, more resource intensive product. And if you look at batteries, that's can be very hazardous specifically. And, you know, extended producer responsibility is very important for products like batteries. So it is diverse and varied, but, you know, we are working towards that. We don't really work on the kind of design phase at the RBA. So I can't really speak to how the companies are working at the sort of design phase, which I agree with Patrick, that's kind of critical. But what we are doing is trying to help them track recyclers. And that's through standardization of the info they need and where their products are going and the sharing back of that information to them.
Okay, thank you. Now I know that we're coming up towards the end, so I just want to open it up a bit to everybody here to ask any questions that you may have for the panel. There are a number of questions already. Could I take the gentleman in the centre and then Nicole, please? So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. A really interesting panel, so thank you very much indeed. I'm Paul Eakins from University College London International Resource Panel. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the illegal stuff. I think Sonia was the only person who actually mentioned the illegality. I was at a conference in Amazonas last week, and illegal mining in Amazonas is big business. I mean, this is real organized crime. And if we are talking about shortages of these metals, the prices are going to go through the roof. And the incentives for illegality on a big scale are huge. We heard earlier in this conference that $84 billion worth of stuff comes out of Africa illegally. So, you know, any system that you're designing, I mean, you all seem to be representing companies and organizations that want to do the right thing. But there's lots of bad actors out there who don't want to do the right thing, who just want to make a lot of money. And I just feel that that needs to be part of the mindset of these tracking initiatives, while recognizing, obviously, it's incredibly difficult. And, you know, where that number 84 billion comes from, God only knows, because who knows? This stuff is not being... Anyway, I mean, just a little bit about that, because I think that's an elephant in the room to some extent.
If I may expand a little bit on that. Definitely, when mapping the value chain, we have all these actors, and one or the other is, as you say, in the hidden, in the shadow, that we exactly don't know. Can be, depending on the region, yeah, you talk about artisanal mining, but now we can have the traders that we many times don't know who they are. I think these are the bits in the value chain where we struggle to get information. We struggle to still engage in the responsible sourcing act or practices. There needs work to be done there, we agree, but we now are clearer on the need to address that. At least information that we are asking for is looking into that. We hope that some of this information is provided. So is a yes and no answer, not yet, but yes answer in the sense that we are aware of the urgent need to address that.
I think you're already starting to see that, for example, in certain places. You know, I mentioned the South Africa example earlier today, and, you know, companies via associations have exerted some influence at the local regulatory level in South Africa. For example, that recyclers are not allowed to purchase chops. So basically chopped up wires, so copper wires. Obviously, that doesn't stop people from melting them and selling them as ingots or something like that, but it's an additional step. And you know, we have to figure out what's the right role for us as private companies, you know, to play, and we can do that best via associations. Because at the end of the day, and also knowing who our suppliers are and being able to have working relationships and understanding what their you know, what they're trying to do and what their impact is and what their goals and values are as well, and trying to only work with people that we, you know, whose values we agree with.
Yeah, so
Maybe I can jump in as well. Oh, sorry.
yeah, please go ahead, Tyler.
No, I mean, I think it's a good point. And, you know, we didn't spend a lot of time on all the different issues. In fact, we're trying to tie it all together. But illegality and specifically crime, which are different, by the way, are huge concerns and are core to at least the RBA's code of conduct. I mean, you know, compliance with the law is the basis of corporate ethics in general. The fact of the matter is, first of all, most environmental human rights impacts occur because of lack of enforcement of some law. We don't really have as much of a regulatory gap as we have an enforcement gap worldwide. When you look at environmental protection and human rights abuses, I mean, most countries have prohibited forced labor, but it is still right. It is still widely used bonded forms of labor around the world. So, I mean, sadly, you know, enforcement of the law is a challenge. Now, like artisanal small-scale mining, and, you know, we have done a lot of work on this, there are many shades of gray here between informal, illegal, and criminal. And, you know, we have to be very careful about assuming everything is criminal, because as I think Sonia was saying, you know, this is subsistence activity. And that gets us to another issue, which is, of course, development and poverty, which are the roots of some of this informal activity. You know, I don't think artisanal miners, you know, necessarily want to be working in dangerous conditions, but that is the reality of the lives that they live in. The challenge, of course, is that companies are just not naturally good development actors. You know, I would question whether all governments are either, but, you know, it does require us to work, you know, outside the typical means of sort of supplier kind of requirements. Because if you're going to try to address informality and illegality in your supply chain, you need to work on formalizing the economy. You need to work on helping bring, you know, better techniques and better ways of working, alternative modes of sort of working into their lives. And that's a long-term, multi-year with development actors kind of activity. And so, but I don't want to underplay, that is a major part. And I started off by saying at least 85% of e-waste goes through sort of informal channels. And a lot of that informal is probably illegal.
Thank you. And so that's one of the key things with the roundtable, is to try to shine a light on some of this transparency, sharing that information, making sure that those flows are happening. Now, Nicole, you had a question as well.
I did. I know we're low on time.
Yeah.
I had a couple questions, but you can pick it up with me afterwards and I will not be offended. I think it was Patrick, right? So I was so encouraged to hear this design for recycling is happening, because I'm a little ignorant, didn't know that was so far advanced, but I didn't quite understand the incentive for the partnership. So I understand why you would want something to be more easily recycled, but why would the car company or the building contractors who are doing this work with you, what's their incentive? Because that's really exciting. And then my other question was a bigger one of, by asking for more information about the recycling supply chain, are we at risk of having less material be recycled? Because it's going to be harder. If I want to drop off my copper wire I found on the side of the road at a recycling place to be collected, but I'm going to need to fill out a questionnaire of exactly where I found it and when and what did I do with it. Are we at risk of kind of further hurting our planetary boundary kind of requirements because we're asking for more? And that's not something we had in the ASM or the artisanal scale sector quite so much, that I just want to make sure we cover when we talk about recycling. So that second question might be a bigger one to cover in our last minute, but if a quick response from you, Patrick, would be awesome on the first one.
Okay. The driver legislation, and also realization that move to EV and the carbon impact of a vehicle now is very much at the front end and at the back end, and very much less so in the middle of the use of that vehicle, depending on how it's charged, obviously. Historically, vehicles in use have been that has been the largest carbon emitter, effectively. What the realization now is that come end of life, there's a significant value associated with that vehicle, and now that nervousness around the EV redraft, the end of life vehicle redraft regulations, where they're compelling manufacturers to use recycled material, is suddenly switching them onto the fact that they need to make their vehicles more readily recyclable. So that's the key driver. The same with the buildings, actually. So we've noticed in, again, I keep talking UK-centric, apologies for that, but we've noticed in London, for example, that contractors, planners, builders are very carbon conscious. So they're interested in low carbon steel products, really. So if we can get them out and use them, then we can demonstrate a low carbon component for that next building. So what we've done with that is we've again, it's interesting here in the issue around certification and accreditation. What we've done is we've gone third-party accreditation for it to put an EPD in place to have an environmental product declaration for reusable steels. So we can say, right, we'll take that steel item out. We will give you carbon associated with that particular item. We'll test it, we'll validate it, and we'll return it back to you. But it's a design change in the way an architect builds a building. We're thinking about it more in context of Lego sets. So Lego is infinite. You can be infinitely creative with Lego, can't you? But fundamentally, the bricks are the same. That's what we're trying to do with the construction piece as well. So we will provide 4 meter lengths, 5 meter lengths of reusable steel, and you can do what you need to do with that. So you can be as creative as you like. So the drivers are really around that carbon piece, and that's that use of material. So the understanding that that's how we're going to manage that aspect of the build, the reuse of the materials.
Very briefly.
There's also a change in business model. So the ownership of the endpoint also changes. So for example, the car, when you're going to these massive OEMs that are leasing cars to, and they never relinquish ownership, being able to actually maximize the final asset value is actually pretty important from a cost basis. So you're seeing that a lot as well.
Thank you. Okay, and we started a bit late. We'll finish a little bit late, but I don't want to keep you from coffee, and I've got to plug our session tomorrow. But Ladin, please.
Just a short comment and question. EMR, I think, recycling 10 million tons of ferrous scrap and 1 million tons of non-ferrous scrap. Is that correct?
9 million ferrous, 1 million non-ferrous.
Okay. So you got a big purchasing power in your supply chain, and I didn't hear any quantity from your end.
About 1 million.
Yeah. So another big buyer. I think we need to start using our purchasing powers. That's one comment from my end. I had a quick look at your purchasing specification, which is available on public. There are addressing of ESG issues, but there could be more strong addressing of the ESG requirements. Just a comment. Thank you.
Okay, so the use of public procurement and specifications to drive change. Great. Now, I appreciate that we are now eating into the coffee break, and I don't want to do that. But I would invite you, hopefully the panelists will be around if you want to catch them to ask further questions. But you will also have another opportunity to discuss this and actually get involved in helping us create some common expectations for due diligence of recycled metals tomorrow morning at 11 in plenary E, which is upstairs on the 3rd floor, and you have to kind of go around if you haven't found it yet. But I urge you to come along, participate, and help us understand how to do that. Now, just to get a sense, is there any very final questions from the floor? Otherwise, coffees await everybody. Okay, so I'm just going to finally thank our panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you to Tyler online. Thank you very much to you all for your questions and for joining this session. And do join us tomorrow. So thanks once again.